Travis in Novato, California on the 10th of April, 2020, talking to Jeff Bland in Seattle proper, or are you in the suburb?
I'm over in Bainbridge Island,
Oh,
just a
Bainbridge.
ferry right away.
Yeah, that's totally different. Yeah. Um, and we have known each other, what, 40 some years?
Yeah,
Very
unbelievable.
little contact in the interim, but when I decided to take on this project, you were immediately in my sights. And it took me a while to track you down, but I got you.
Thank
So I
you.
want to find out who you are and why. And the world pretty much knows what you've done, but I want to get behind why you've done it. What motivated you to be such a pioneer, beginning with where you were born and childhood, siblings, birth order, schooling, all those influential factors. So take it away, Jeff.
Okay, well, thank you. And let me just say the obvious that one of those influencers in my career was you. So I don't want to fail to acknowledge that when you were really one of the leaders in this whole field in Mill Valley, and I was still early in my development as a professional, and I was at the Pauling Institute on sabbatical from my university professorship in the early 80s. I'll come to that. You were an influencer of mine. So just want to acknowledge that relationship. Yeah. So for me, the story began really, obviously, I was born post-World War II, first birthdays of the baby boomer generation, 1946, which means I'm 74 now. And my father was an airman in the Air Force, and came back to school in the VA to his home base, which was Illinois. And he had met a woman in his training as a Air Force bomber pilot in California, Hollywood, actually. A woman who he dated before he was sent overseas and did 42 missions in the Air Force. And they got married. My mother, Marjorie, was a Hollywood High girl, and she went then to Illinois to start her life with my father and have me in Peoria, Illinois. But being a California girl, she only lasted 2 winters in Illinois. And said to him, I love you, but this isn't cutting it for me. So they moved out to California. My dad, over many years, was a chartered accountant by that time. Training went back under the VA to get his degree in accounting and was a CPA, but then later got into his hobby, which was electronics, and that led him into eventually getting a master's degree in engineering. And then he became one of the early stage people in the Hughes Tool and Die Company in aerospace, and spent the rest of his career in aerospace engineering and working for different firms that were involved with space development, space exploration, and defense. So I grew up in a household in Southern California that had my sister, who was 4 years younger, and I as the recipients of what my parents delivered to us, which I've come to recognize now was probably a very unusual post-World War II, father knows best upbringing, in which neither my sister and I ever remembered our parents actually arguing with one another in all the years we were at home. And so there was a very, it was a very tranquil household, very supportive of their children's development. My mother was a full-time mother and really dedicated to serving her children and getting the best environment she could think of. So we were lucky to get the music lessons and a lot of sports activities and community involvement that my parents were involved with. So I feel now, as I look back, being very fortunate. I just, by the luck of the draw, I think had parents that were very unique in the way they got on one with the other. They're both deceased now, but I felt that they set a very good role model for my sister and I in respect for one another. My dad had huge respect for my mother, and I always grew up thinking that women, deserved high respect and had high skills. And I think my sister the opposite, because my father treated her as she could do anything she wanted as a woman. She shouldn't be held back. And she now lives in Sausalito, California, and has made a very good way with her husband. They have 2 remarkable children that are both very talented. I went on then to eventually go through my undergraduate school at the University of California. I was on the first graduating class in a new UC campus at Irvine in 1966. I was a dual major in chemistry and biology. Was going on to medical school, and as a consequence of really wanting to know a lot of questions to be answered, which, as you know, are not really things that you should be asking in medical school. The first couple of years, you had to just keep your nose to the grindstone and shut up and learn what they tell you to learn. But I was the 1,000-question guy, and I was kind of very young and impetuous, and probably not the easiest guy to get along with if you're a faculty member. I was always asking questions, and finally was pulled aside on my my third year and said, you know, Jeff, you have a lot of questions, and in medical school, we really don't have a lot of time to answer questions. You'll have your whole life to answer questions, and right now you just should be learning how to be a doctor that we're teaching you how to be, and forget the questions. But if you really want to have these questions answered, you probably need to go over and get a PhD, because they really like you asking questions. So I transferred over into the PhD program, which actually was a very good decision for me in my personality and my intellectual approach to learning. But I was obviously very closely interested in the biological sciences and in medicine specifically. So when I finally got out of my PhD program, my real driving interest was understanding why people got ill, particularly with chronic illnesses. And I probably was more interested in that than what we called them. I was less interested in the diagnostic ICD-9s and more interested in how did you get there? What was the process that led you there? And that has been a burning interest of mine. Probably my mother told me when I had conversations with her years ago, she said, Jeff, this has been your kind of driving interest ever since grammar school. You've always been the 1,000-question guys about why people got these illnesses. And so it's logical that you would stay in this area because it's been your passion for all these years. So that led me then into an academic position in 1970 at the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington, where I had the fortune of having a dual appointment. That was a pretty tough time to get academic jobs because of the Vietnam War. There were, hundreds of people, actually thousands of people, trying to get academic jobs in science that were unsuccessful. And I was fortunate that I did get a really great job for me as my first job out of school, in that it was a dual appointment in biochemistry and environmental science. They were just starting an environmental science program because it was Earth Day year.
Right.
And they wanted to start a program, undergraduate program in environmental science. So I had this really wonderful way to learn from my students. If you can really think about it, when I was an assistant professor, I was 24 years old. So I wasn't much older than my students. And so it was a really great environment for me to learn from them and me to learn and to explore. And I found being in a liberal arts college was very good for me because I was able to do team teaching with professors from the philosophy department, the history of science department, the business school, and just get kind of a broad education just by being a faculty and doing team teaching with a variety of other professors. So that then ultimately led me to start my research, which my first research student, a gentleman by the name of Phil Madden, turned out to be a really great research student. And we got some nice grants to explore what he wanted to study, which I look back and I think, wow, that was really kind of a guided thing. This would be 1972. And his interest when he came to interview me as a potential research professor to oversee his thesis development was he wanted to study vitamin E. Well, I knew nothing about vitamin E, really. I mean, I knew trivial amount about it, but certainly not much about its physiology or its biochemistry. I would not call myself at all skilled in the art of any of the nutrients at that point. And so he said, well, I think vitamin E sounds like a really interesting thing to study because there's a lot of claims that are being made for it. It's in the news a lot. It has all these supposed benefits, but if I really look at the literature, it looks like it's got a lack of really good science. So I'd like to study it. So we came up with a research project, which turned out to be extraordinarily, I guess on hindsight, was very creative. We were the first group to really study in humans the effect of vitamin E on red cell hemolysis. We used the red cell as a model system for how vitamin E influenced injury to cells. And just to make a long story a little bit longer, but I think it's a humorous anecdote, after we published a number of papers from the discoveries we'd made, and when we got pretty deep into it, looking at membrane composition and the effect that vitamin E and doing structural studies of how vitamin E fit into the lipid bilayer of cells and influence their injury and so protection against injury. I was in the supermarket one Saturday because I often did, was my job to do the shopping for the family on Saturdays. And so I had my two sons at that point with me that were very little at the time. Let's see, they would have been something at that age. So this is like 75. So they'd have been 7 and 4. So they were with me. And I was going to the checkout counter with them. And I just looked over, as everybody does when they're waiting in line, at the magazines, you know, the tabloid magazines. And there was the big issue that week. And on the cover, it said, "Professor finds secret to aging." And I thought, wow, that's kind of interesting. I wonder what that's about. So I picked up the magazine out of the rack there while I was waiting to check out my groceries. And lo and behold, the professor was me. And it was a big photograph of me in the laboratory with my research students doing this work on biological aging, basically, of cells. And what happened as a consequence of that was it led to immediate overwhelm of our chemistry department secretarial pool. We got thousands of calls. I don't even know how many thousands, but let's say enough that I became persona non grata within my own department, because suddenly they're saying, hold it, well, you know, you're disturbing the flow of us and our normal workflow by having all this interruption, the phones ringing in all the time and so forth and so on. So I had a decision to make at that point as to what I was going to do. I could have either fallen back to become kind of a traditional chemist and just unplugged from the vitamin E work, or I guess, you know, the other alternative was I could have taken this as an opportunity to refocus my career as a scientist into this area of nutrition, and it's related to cell biology and health. And so obviously I chose the latter of the two, which then required me to hire my own secretary and to develop my own kind of identity, departing from a traditional kind of chemistry professor. And that was a good news, bad news story in my life, because the good news was that now I was opened up to a whole new world of education and understanding, and much more closely interfacing with medicine and biology and consumers who were interested in nutrition, which was, now I was being introduced to talks I was giving as a nutritionist. And I thought, you know, I wonder who they're introducing, because I never thought of myself to be a nutritionist at all, but that was the designation I was given because I'd been doing this work on vitamin E. That work on vitamin E that led itself into me ultimately developing quite a large research group, over 35 investigators in my group. We published many papers, did work on all sorts of other things. And that led into a sabbatical 2 years that I was invited to have at the Linus Pauling Institute in Palo Alto with Dr. Linus Pauling, 2-time Nobel Prize winning laureate. And that was a life change.
Were you still at the university when you split off from the chemistry department?
Yeah. I stayed at the university, was obviously tenured. In fact, I think I was the earliest tenured professor in the history of the university, of that university. And I then, with these 2 years of sabbatical at the Pauling Institute, it was a life change experience for me. And something happened for me personally that, you know, we all have these epic moments in our life that we look back and say, wow, that was a point of inflection. I may not even have realized at the time how important it was. So as I was packing up my office to leave, and my office at the Pauling Institute happened to be right next to Dr. Pauling's office, so I had quite a bit of an opportunity over a couple of years to have informal conversations with him about all sorts of topics that he was interested in, peace and social justice and free elections in Guatemala and science collaboration with Russia. And I mean, all sorts of interesting conversations. And as I was packing up, he was, you know, saying a couple of nice things, saying it was great to have had me at the institutes and that I'd made some good contributions. And he hoped that we would continue to be able to collaborate as I moved back into my previous professorial job. And I was very flattered to have that conversation. And then as I picked up my boxes off my desk to walk to my car, to put my family in the car and drive back to the state of Washington from California, his last comment to me was, "Well, Jeff, I wish you well. And I just wondered, do you think your classroom is big enough?" That was his last comment. And I had a chance to stew on that all the way driving home, 1,100 miles back to where we were living at the time, Fox Island, Washington, near Tacoma, Washington. And by the time I got home, I had kind of translated the not so hidden meaning in that question. And I made the decision to give up my tenure, give up the opportunity I had for the college education of my children to be paid for, give up the comfortiness of a university professorship where I was actually very well liked by the university and had the biggest research group and could teach anything I wanted with any member of the department, and to actually become an entrepreneur, to start a company to teach physicians how to do preventive nutrition in their practice. That was my business plan. I announced that to my father when I drove into our place, and because I had moved my parents up by that time. My dad had taken early retirement from the aerospace industry, and he was tending our house, he and my mother, while we were gone. And so I sat down with them in the living room, and I was happy to be back. The grandkids were happy to see them. And then I said, and I've had this kind of epiphanal decision that I'm actually going to give up my tenured faculty position, and I'm going to start a company to help educate doctors how to do preventive nutrition in their practice. And there was a deathly silence in the room. And then my dad, who actually had always wanted to be a university professor, and so there was a little bit of vicarious appreciation of his son being in that profession, he then, I think his first words were, "You got to be kidding me." And then there was a moment of silence. And then my mother, who knows me quite well, she said, "Stu," that was my dad's name, Stewart, "I think Jeff is serious." And that created an interesting cascading conversation for the next half an hour as to how I could be so irresponsible, having 3 children and family, a mortgage, cars, all the kind of things that we do, and a job where I was well respected and liked and tenured, and they couldn't fire me, and blah, blah, blah. And gee whiz, what do I know about business? Which was nothing. And but then my mother, as mothers often do, brought a moment of context to it. And she said, "You're right in everything you're saying, Stu, but quite honestly, Jeff is, as we know, and as a son all these years, is a man of passion. And he always seems to be able to take his passion, and even if it seems maybe unrealistic or not very logical, he seems to make it work in the end. Maybe we ought to just go with the flow." Well, then my dad, and this was an epic moment, I think, between a father and a son. He then kind of took a moment, pause, and said, "Well, okay, if you're going to do this, then I got to come out of retirement because you know nothing about business, and I am an accountant, so I better be your business manager."
Oh.
So for the next 6 years, my dad and I had the wonderful opportunity to work very closely together. My mother became an editor of the company. She was very good with words, and so she edited a lot of the content we were developing. My father was the business manager and handling the accounting. Went back to night school at night to learn how to program a K-Pro computer to do the first spreadsheets.
I had a K-Pro, had 2 of them.
Yeah, the old CPM language, right?
Yeah.
And then my wife became our VP of corporate development, and that was the company we called HealthCom. And then HealthCom grew up over the course of the next, let's see, so that would have been 84, 85. It grew up then over the next 15 years, the next 15 years to have 1,100 employees and be in 36 countries. So that was, and there's all sorts of obviously stories in between that, but I just cut to the chase as to where it went. In the course of then developing that company, HealthCom, and ultimately growing it up, we did something that my wife Susan was really instrumental in promoting, and that is to start a an educational institute that we called the Institute for Functional Medicine in 1990. And that was started as a consequence of me constantly telling her as I was traveling around the world visiting various people, and I have had the fortune or misfortune of traveling over 6 million miles, and have covered more than 70 countries over the years. And I had met all these remarkable people like yourself that had tremendous ideas and insights that I think I'm a pretty good sponge. I'm not sure how much I've originally created, but I think I'm a very good listener and a very good cataloger of ideas, and hopefully a good communicator of those ideas. So I then would come home and I would tell Susan, my wife, about these things that I had observed. And eventually then in 1990, she said, well, you know, why don't you, or why don't we sponsor a meeting, and you can bring some of these thought leaders that you've talked about over these years together to have a whiteboard discussion about what would the healthcare system look like if it was idealized, if it wasn't shackled by reimbursement, licensure, you know, coding, certain types of things. If it was just theoretically, what would it look like? So we hosted a meeting then. There were about 40 people that we invited, that we brought in from various disciplines, not just medicine, but informatics, and I mean, all sorts of different disciplines. And we sat for 2 days in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada, on Vancouver Island. Very pleasant place to be isolated, but have a creative thought process. And we started doing this what if. And by the end of that, everyone agreed that that was a really fruitful discussion. We should do it again another year. So then the following year at the same time, in the spring, so actually the first one was 1989, the second one was 1990, we brought the same group back, and by that time we'd been communicating with one another and coming up with a more codified structure, what we wanted to talk about. And that led me on the Saturday night, in between the Saturday meetings and our final Sunday meeting, to have this, I'm going to call it a dream, let's just call it a thought, that what we should call what we were doing is functional medicine. And when I came back this next morning on Sunday, the last day of the get-together, and I proposed that to my colleagues, they said, well, we really don't like that word, you know, because functional medicine already has kind of a pejorative connotation in medicine. It's either rehabilitative medicine or psychosomatic medicine. It's not got really any pizzazz. And I think that would be inappropriate to pick that up. It's got a bad stigma. And I said, well, yeah, I agree with you. That's true. However, I kind of pride myself on following the medical literature very carefully. And over the last several years, I've seen the term functional being recontextualized with now functional radiology and functional cardiology and functional endocrinology, in which it's gaining a different definition that really comes more to what Linus Pauling was talking about when he defined the concept of molecular medicine. It's more related to systems thinking and how the body works before it ends up at a diagnosable disease state that we call pathology. And so it could really be a way of defining upstream processes that give rise to downstream pathology. And we talked about that, and maybe I was convincing, or maybe it was because we were hosting the meeting, but finally everyone said, okay, we'll give functional a whirl. And so we then codified the Institute for Functional Medicine as an educational institute in 1990, had our first international meeting in 1991. And that organization has now grown up. I'm very proud to say now it's a 501c3 with its own ACCME Category 1 accrediting capability. It has over 200,000 practitioners that have gone through it. And it's the fastest growing medical organization in the United States. And I'm very, very proud to have been part of the inception of that idea. It has a textbook, the textbook of functional medicine. It has all sorts of learning tools. It has a very rich legacy of faculty of esteem. It's connected into many medical schools around the world now as a learning option. And so it's gained traction. And what I made the decision to do, actually Susan and I both, Susan, my wife, was also obviously a founder and on the board, in 2001, so that would have been 10 years after we started the Institute, we both made the decision that it would be good for us to completely step off the board and any kind of formal relationship with the Institute because it was starting to be called the Jeff Bland Institute. And I thought that was very limiting in
Yeah.
where we wanted this thing to go. And the only way to free that up was for us to step away. So we gifted our contributions to the public. We stepped off the board and allowed the IFM to proceed without us. Obviously, we were still unattached, interested in what was going on, and I still was involved for educational opportunities if they wanted, but we were not directing or controlling the administration of the organization. And so then the next 10 years, it went very, very well. It actually ended up being run by both a close colleague, medical doctor of mine, Dr. David Jones from Ashland, Oregon, who is the medical director, and then a woman that I had worked with for a number of years previously, Lori Hoffman is her name, who came in and ultimately became the CEO and was extraordinarily good in running the organization and developing a strategic plan and executing on it. And it became the most successful organization of its type over those course of those 10 years under her leadership. And then after that, it was time for me. I was asked to step back on the board as an emeritus board chairman, and then more recently, within the last 4 years, as a formal board member, knowing that there'd probably been enough time to wash out the thought that it was a Jeff Bland Institute. Mm-hmm. So it's now doing all sorts of good things, and it has its own ACCME accreditation for postgraduate continuing courses. Thanks to really Susan Bland starting that process when she was involved back in the early 90s. She shepherded us all the way through that ACCME process. We hired a variety of professionals to guide us through that process of approval. And the IFM now, the Institute for Functional Medicine, has a meritorious 6-year accreditation, which is very rare that ACD gives that out. So that takes us then up to 6 years of accreditation without having to be reviewed.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so they normally give 1 year provisional at first. Then if you pass muster, they give 3 years. That's generally what they would do as a 3-year, mm-hmm. But a 6-year is with commendation. It's very unusual.
Great. Well, now you've mentioned Susan a bunch of times. Let's go back and how did you meet? And let's fill in your personal life.
Yeah. So Susan, what often happens in our lives, obviously, is the unexpected, which then we look back and say, oh yeah, well, I knew that was going to happen. Well, I did not. Now, for me, the way it happened, well, for her as well, is we were, she was has a master's in communications and public relations, and she had a public relations company that was doing book promotions and book development for authors in the health field. It was out of, her company was in Denver, Colorado. And I was speaking at a meeting in Dallas, and we both were in line to register. She was, I think, right in front of me. And as we, it was a fairly long line, so we got in this conversation, and it was really a fun and engaging conversation. And by the time we got to the front of the line, it turned out that they had, even though we had reservations for rooms, they were overbooked and they had no rooms for us. So, and I was a speaker. So that created a little bit of an interesting moment of tension. In working that through, then they said, well, I guess we could find one space for you. This is this large room, but you two are going to have to share it. And we'd only met one another like just, an hour previously. And it was a very large room, and it had two bedrooms, so that wasn't like we had to stay in the same room, but it shared a living room in between. So we accepted that as an alternative, and of course, over the time then of the next 3 days of the meeting, we ran into one another all the time and had lots of conversations. And then as she went to my talk, when we met later that afternoon, she said, well, that was a very good presentation you gave, but your book that you've talked about, that you've just authored, that's just been published, is never going to be successful. And I said, really? Why is that? She said, well, your promotion really is worthless. I mean, you need a PR agency. And I said, oh, geez, I never thought of it that way. I thought I could author a book and put it on the bookshelves and that would be it. And she said, well, that's very naive. That's not true. This was 1982. And So she said, I think you ought to hire me as your public relations firm, which I did. And she made that book a good seller. But more than that, we created a business plan that led us into development of a seminar series called the Stewart Seminars. And that was her last name and my father's name, and my middle name was Stewart. So
Wow.
we called it Stewart Seminars. And that seminar series, I know this is sounding probably overly strong, but let's say it for many individuals, introduced them as medical professionals into how to do therapeutic nutrition in ways that made sense and were science grounded. And it became very successful. We had tens of thousands of people over the years attend our seminars. And in fact, it's interesting to date today, and so this is like a lot of years ago, I still have some of the physicians who came to these courses that are now retired come up to me with the original audio tapes that were produced, these kind of vinyl tapes that we produced in those courses that had been saved all these many years, saying, do you remember this course that I attended that's on this audio tape? So it started it started making this business that I left the Pauling Institute to start. It started making it real. So that's how we met. It ultimately led us into, so what happened very, very quickly actually was the recognition that there was a lot more energy between the two of us than just our professional relationship. So that ultimately led us into a romantic relationship, and then ultimately to kind of this epic discussion that we had, which was actually at a meeting we were both attending, in which we went to some kind of a dinner show after the meeting, and at that point we both acknowledged that, hey, we need to take this kind of feelings that we had for one another seriously. It was obviously more than just something that we were sharing professionally. So that led into us getting married, and the last many decades since have been extraordinarily amazing. It was just
working together and in a marriage is doubly hard. So
it is. It's the best of all times, and it can be the most challenging, no question.
I had 20 good years of it myself, and the last 10 years it kind of deteriorated having kids. And you have how many kids?
We have actually 3 sons that now have, 2 of them have families, so we have 5 grandchildren. So it's just the right number. It's I can remember everybody's names and birthdays, so that's good. Yeah, and so from that, all sorts of other things happen as a consequence, obviously, of eventually building a company that had 1,100 employees and was, activities around the world. We met so many just really remarkable people that we call friends and colleagues that were connected to us initially through business, but then later became really close personal friends. So I spent a lot of time in hotel rooms and on planes, but the payoff for that is that we really feel we have an extraordinary extended family, and I've learned so much from people who have different backgrounds and different cultures. And our children and grandchildren now have benefited from this because they've been exposed and started traveling young and visiting people with different ideas. And I think they have hopefully a great acceptance and appreciation for different perspectives and different cultures. And I believe that we hopefully have been a good role model for them as it relates to open heart and open mind and open consciousness that produces the unexpected miracles of a life well lived. So that's kind of the summary lesson plan.
Yeah. There was another little hole back there doing the math. It sounds like you skipped a few grades in order to graduate from UC Irvine when you did.
Yeah, I did. That was another good news, bad news story. I was accelerated because I was tall. The principals of my schools, when I was tested, like we all go through those tests in elementary and in junior high school, they said, oh, gee, well, he's way ahead of his grade in terms of where he is. So, and he's big, so he can be pushed up and, should be culturally able to adapt very well. And I think to some extent that was true. I mean, I got a couple of years head start, but on the other side, it was very, very interesting because as I look back, and I think probably people can identify with this from their own experience, there's this whole acculturation experience that you can't accelerate. I mean, it just comes from living of life. And so what happened was I was an athlete and a musician. I was pretty good basketball player. I had a basketball scholarship going into college, but I was always 2 years younger in age than my colleagues in the same grade. And so my coaches would say, you know, you're really good. It's just too bad that you're not in the same age of your grade that you should be, because you'd be like the best. So that's kind of a mixed message, isn't it? And then similarly with music, I played brass instruments. I was pretty good. I was in the all-state California band and orchestra in high school, and I had several music groups when I was in college. I played at Disneyland. I played, well, our group played all over. We made several records, and the same thing there as well. That people would say, "Wow, you know, you're really accelerated for your age. If you're just a few years older in acculturation, like I couldn't be playing at bars legally, you know, when I was 18 and was playing with musicians that were in their middle 20s. So it's a mixed blessing. But in looking back, I certainly had the advantage of kind of accelerated learning opportunities.
Mm-hmm. And going back to when I first met you, Chuck Hess was became a close friend. He'd come to some of our seminars. He came down to Costa Rica when we were doing a workshop there. And I remember he had a health food store in Atlanta or something, as well as being a Delta pilot. And he carried his own food because he didn't want to eat the airline crap. And he introduced us, I think, at a workshop or a conference in Atlanta, probably late 80s or mid 80s.
That's right. Exactly.
And, that's when
Chuck was, for both of us, was a very good friend. He spent a lot of time at our house on Fox Island. He was a business partner of mine. I had started, over the years, I've started more than, I think it's now 26 companies in different areas.
Wow.
And so he was a partner of mine in one of those companies that serviced the Georgia Tech athletic program. That later then, interestingly, got transferred over to a colleague and friend of mine in Atlanta, because it was hard for me to service that from the state of Washington to service Georgia Tech. So I had one of my friends and colleagues, Dr. Alexander Brawley, who started a company called Metametrics, which was a medical laboratory, serve them. And so Annie Brawley then grew up with the Chuck Hess Georgia Tech connection, and ultimately then his company, Metametrics, became a major medical lab in our field, and they then later merged with Great Smokies to become Genovic Diagnostic Labs, which is the largest laboratory in the kind of holistic, integrative, functional space. So there are all these intertwinings over the years that are very, very fascinating when I think back.
I had the woman that helped me start the wellness center moved to Asheville, and through her and a friend of hers, I got a tour of Great Smokies and learned about them back in probably the early 80s. So another connection. And
Asheville, Stephen Berry and Marty Lee were good colleagues of mine. I was a part owner of Great Smokies and was on their board for 20 years. And, as they made this transition into Genova and the merger ultimately with Metametrics, it was a wonderful run. In fact, at one time, I think this would have been about 2003 or 4. We were going to merge Great Smokies with my company, HealthCom. We were going to call DXRX, Diagnosis and Treatment Using Integrative Therapies. So there's all sorts of interesting stories that are part of the color of the people that we both interacted with over the years, John.
And there's another connection I want to explore with you, but back in that same period, actually it was in 79, I think, I invited several physician friends who were into holistic stuff to a conference in Richmond, Virginia. And afterwards, when we realized that we were all kind of on the same wavelength, we decided to form an organization, which we have named Metadox. We were between orthodox and paradox. And we found out our logo was a benzene ring with MDs and the meta position on them.
Oh, that's interesting. I remember that now that you reminded me. Yeah. Oh.
And there were 8 or 9 of us originally, and we made a commitment to meet for 20 years, 3 days, twice a year, mostly on the East Coast. I was a token West Coast guy, and I'd fly out for some of the meetings. And then when I moved to Australia, I backed out of it. It's still going 35 or more years from that.
Wow, that's fantastic.
But then when we did a Google search, we found out you had the name Metadox and connected with Metagenics.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Oh, that's right. We did. I forgot about that. That's right. Yeah. Oh my word. That's interesting.
I'm not
sure. Yeah, there's another connection.
We argued whether to spell it D-O-C or D-O-X. D-O-C won, but I'm not sure which spelling you were using when I Googled it some time ago. But
yeah, we were using a DOC, but I think your use of it was a lot more lightened than ours. Our use was very pedantic. It was just around kind of information that we were supplying to doctors through the Metagenics information system. It's a lot more pedantic than what you were doing.
Yeah. Well, in Mullumbimby, where I live half the year, the local herb shop all carries Metagenics products, and as well as a health food store. So one of the countries you obviously reached was Australia. So,
well, we became actually the largest provider of nutrition products through practitioners in Australia through, that's a whole nother story that I could bore you with, but one of my good friends, and I became a godfather to one of his sons, was Michael Hall, who started the first pharmacy professional line of nutritional supplements in Australia. It was called BioGlan. And I became a consultant to BioGlan in the late 70s, early 80s. Ultimately, he became a business partner of mine. We then jointly, he was involved with HealthCom from its startup. And then when we made the transition into merging HealthCom with Metagenics in 2000, then Michael Hall and his group then broke away to his sons to form their own company called Bioceuticals. And we then acquired the Australian distributorship called Health World, which became Metagenics Australia. So all of the imprint of those years of travel to Australia have kind of left a very interesting legacy. And similarly in Western Europe with groups that we kind of pioneered there with Francis Mays, Dr. Mays in Ostende, Belgium, and France, and Ken Eddy in London, and Peter Wilhelmsen in Sweden. We did a similar thing, roll up there, and now in Italy as well. So those are all parts of the history of the people I was referring to that were all leaders in their own areas that took this and ran with it, and really has started to create the revolution that I was hopeful when we started back in 1984 might ultimately come out of these activities.
A couple other loose ends, and I don't want to explore that more. But when I was in college at Worcester in early 60s, Linus came and spoke to us. And I remember him walking down the aisle, right? I was on an aisle end seat, and I got to be that close to Linus Pauling.
He was that kind of a man. The thing that a lot of people don't understand about Linus Pauling is the extraordinary power that he derived from Eva Helen, his wife. I don't know if you know that story, but I'll just summarize it. I'll try to make this quick. So Linus Pauling was born in Eastern Oregon in a rural community. His father was a pharmacist in a very rural small town in Eastern Oregon. He was always very interested in pharmaceutical science and later chemistry, and was very precocious, obviously. He then ended up getting accelerated in school and ended up at Oregon Teachers College, which later has become Oregon State University in Corvallis, on the western side of the state of Oregon. And so when he started in as a student at Oregon State Teachers College, it was recognized this guy was like super brilliant and very fast learner. And he started teaching actually at the college as a faculty, a kind of a surrogate pseudo faculty member. I guess you call him a lecturer, which ultimately worked him into an accelerated PhD and a faculty position as a professor. And then one of his students, because he was teaching in the nursing school, remember this was called Oregon State Teachers College at the time. So they had a nursing school, and his brightest student was this woman, Eva Helen, and who they fell in love. He always claimed that she was a smarter chemist than he was. I'm not sure that was true, but she was very, very bright and very capable. And she then became, over the many decades, not only his sounding board, but in some senses, his social, political, cultural conscience. And she was the one that urged him on in his proactivity in the nuclear disarmament activities and the peace movement that got him to lose his visa to travel to accept his second Nobel Prize in Stockholm during the McCarthy period in our country, a dark period. And he tells, well, first of all, I have a photograph that's one of my most prized possessions that is a reproduction of a picture that I coveted in his office on his wall that he was very kind and made a copy of for me. That was a photo of he and Albert Schweitzer and Albert Einstein at the Olduvai Gorge Schweitzer compound, talking about how they would mobilize 30,000 scientists to sign a declaration for nuclear test, atmospheric test disarmament.
Wow.
And Eva Helen took that photo of them in Africa. And she was a force. And just to tell you an anecdote, which is, I believe to be true, it was told to me by Dr. Pauling, so I believe it to be true. I hope that I'm not getting myself in trouble by saying it from the Pauling family, but his advocacy for socio-political issues really got ignited as a consequence of supposedly an event that occurred, according to the story he told me, at a lecture that he gave at Caltech one evening to the local community. And remember, he was a professor at California Institute of Technology and in chemistry. And he was asked if he would give a lecture on nuclear chemistry, basically. So this would have been the 50s, right in the middle of a lot of controversy post Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And he was a faculty at Caltech, which is in Pasadena, which is right, at least at the time, in the seat of a lot of very influential high net worth people in the defense industry. And so he started talking about nuclear chemistry, and a question came from the audience. And he was like a lecturer that could make people rapt. He just had the ability to tell a story. So a question was asked saying, Dr. Pauling, you're such an expert in this field. What's your feeling about this nuclear arms and nuclear testing? And he said, well, it's very interesting you asked that question. It's a very important question to be answered, but I'm actually a scientist. I'm not a politician, an economist, a sociologist, and I really would be speaking out of my area of expertise if I was to answer that. And I'd like to stay, where I really have my expertise. That's probably why you're here. So I don't really have a specific answer to that question. So he walked off the stage, and Eva Helen obviously was there to hear his talk. And so they got in the car to drive home, and she was livid, according to the story. And she said to him, why in the world did you say what you said? Hugely strong opinions about this. So why did you bypass the question? Because you have strong feelings. And he said, well, I just didn't feel that it was in my area of really expertise, and I didn't want to drift too much away. And she said, well, hold on just a minute. How many people in the United States know as much about nuclear issues as you do? And if you don't speak up with your strong opinions, who is going to speak up? I mean, people to look to you as an authority figure because of your knowledge, and they're asking your opinion. And you have a social responsibility to give them your opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, well, okay, but I really don't feel very comfortable about that. And she said, okay, well, I'll give you an opportunity to be comfortable with it because I'm not cooking meals for you until you have resolved this issue. Now, I may be slightly exaggerating. I don't think so. I'm trying to recount of a conversation that goes quite a few years back, well, actually decades back, that I had with Dr. Pauling. But I think that's the gist of the conversation. So he waited this period out and finally made the decision that she was right. Plus, he liked eating. And so from then on, he became a public advocate, and they worked together. And he felt that she should have at least shared, if not gotten, that second Nobel Prize in peace because of her influence on that whole process.
Now, what date would this be? Early 50s, if it was still McCarthy?
Yeah, early 50s. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Because I also interviewed Helen Caldecott, who picked up
Yes.
the ball later.
Yeah.
But I didn't realize he was.
And she was heavily influenced by Dr. Pauling and Eva Helen as well.
Yeah, yeah. Back, you mentioned that you heard of my work when you were at the Institute. I'm curious.
Well, actually, I think even before the Institute, I'm trying to think of the chronology. I believe that the Atlanta meeting preceded my time at the Institute. So I think I was aware of your work because you were publishing quite extensively in Prevention magazine at that time. And I had a couple
that Don Ardell published about me that was totally inaccurate.
That was it.
I hadn't even opened the center yet. That was 76. But,
okay, so there it is. So that's when I was introduced to you, because in 76, I had a paper in Prevention they interviewed me on my vitamin E work.
Oh.
And that's when Jonathan Wright was a colleague of mine, and he had a regular column in Prevention magazine. Jonathan also being from the Seattle area.
Right.
So he and I kind of started together down this trail in the 70s, he being obviously the medical doctor and I being more the biochemist. So there's a lot of shared lineage. And I think that's when I was first introduced to you, and we had the first opportunity to meet, which through Chuck Hess.
Right. I think that was quite a bit later, though. That was 80,
Yeah.
80, probably 10 years later. Okay, so that's that connection. I'm also curious because of the COVID virus pandemic that we're in the middle of now, that IV vitamin C is getting, first the Chinese came out with, well, I got a link from some orthomolecular people before that, and now apparently some of the New York doctors are using it. And I'm sure that connects to Linus's work. And what connection, if any, is there with the orthomolecular people? Are they still an organization, and did you subsume that?
Yeah, yes, they are. Yeah, they've continued to be a viable organization through all these many decades, and I think it's very, very interesting to look at people like Hugh Reardon, who you probably remember, Dr. Reardon in Wichita, with the Reardon Center. He's now passed away, unfortunately, but he then imprinted very strongly with Dr. Jeannie Driscoll, who is a clinical professor of medicine at the University of Kansas School of Medicine, who was a department chair of this whole concept of orthomolecular medicine. And she was then involved with clinical studies on intravenous vitamin C, also interfaced with Mark Levine at NIH, who has done, as an endocrinologist, done quite a bit of work, probably the only metabolic ward inpatient studies that NIH ever did on vitamin C therapeutics. And so, yes, I think this is kept alive and well within a group of individuals who are still stewarding the therapeutic benefit of not just vitamin C, but also the things that Abraham Hoffer talked about, which you are well aware of, the orthomolecular psychiatry concepts with the use of niacin, pyridoxine, and other B vitamins for the management of various psychiatric disorders. So I think that that organization still lives, still has a journal, still has meetings, and still is engaged in research.
And they're primarily psychiatrically oriented, though, as
I think because of Richard Cunyon, who you know very well over there in San Francisco, who has been a
No, I
principal in the orthomolecular medical movement for decades. Dick Cunyon still plays an important role with the other kind of founding members of the Orthomolecular Medical Association. The other person who was very actively involved was a physician in Mill Valley who just passed away recently. But I think the organization has still maintained its viability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was aware of it back in the 70s, but never really fully understood it. And then when I got this email about the vitamin C for COVID, and then seeing the Chinese come out with it, and then the New York doctors, and I got thinking, well, you know, if I were to contract it, I'd sure want to get some IV vitamin C. And then I wondered, is there much of it around? If it were to be adopted, are there adequate supplies of what do you call it, grade, therapeutic grade vitamin C? Is it widely available, or is it something that's fairly rare? And is that a limiting
Yeah, I
factor?
think that's a very good question. As you probably know, what's happened to the production of vitamins, including vitamin C, over the last couple of decades has transitioned from domestic production by Hoffmann La Roche as being one of the major producers of vitamins to move on, maybe unfortunately, I don't know, it depends on your opinion, I guess, has moved to China. China is really the world's largest producer, I believe, of vitamins. DSM, which is the Dutch company, is also involved with overseeing vitamin production, but a lot of their work is done obviously in Asia as well. So it's an interesting conundrum that we are caught with, because we know a lot of our pharmaceuticals are now made in China, but also a lot of our nutrients are now manufactured in China as well. I'm not trying to denigrate China at all. I'm just trying to say that we have seen a change in the supply side of this occur over the last 20 years.
Yeah.
And so trying to mesh up demand and supply is a little bit different now than it was before.
Right. Interesting. These enormous number of companies that you've started and the empire that you've fostered boggles my mind. I couldn't even manage one little center with, at our peak, we had 13 staff, and that burnt me out. So I'm in awe that you've navigated the waters and produced so much.
Well, let me be very realistic with you, so that I don't give an inflated sense of something here. Of those 26, and the reason I think it's 26 is one of my sons recently said, "So, Dad, how many companies do you think you've been involved with starting or been a principal in over the years since you left academics?" And I was thinking maybe 4 or 5. And he says, "Oh, no, what about this one? What about this one?" His memory was much better than mine. And so we started listing them down, and it came out to 26. Now, what does that say? What that says is that not all 26 were successful, or I probably would have remembered them. So, there's a lot that didn't stand the test of time. But I guess on the law of averages, we were more than 50% on the side of success. So maybe that's the learning curve that is required if you're a serial entrepreneur. But over the years, I have learned a lot about how to convert idealism, which I think I am. I'm a blue sky idealist. I'm an idea person, and find the right people to translate that into executional outcome that hopefully can be sticky. And so I'm really good at coming up with ideas and innovating, and I recognize that I really need great people who are executors to make them become real.
And
so that's probably
starting with your wife.
Yes, and that is definitely was one of the big learning curves because she stood tall against sometimes the vicissitudes of an entrepreneur who is an innovator who needs to learn that everything that they think isn't right, and that's a learning curve too.
I'm also curious because I was influenced by Halbert Dunn's work and his definitions of wellness. And when Dan Rather opened his piece in 1979 saying, wellness, there's a word you don't hear every day, which was true, we had to spell it. And then I largely, probably as a result of that piece, the word caught on, but it lost its meaning. It became so watered down and dumbed down that in the mid 80s, I was ready to drop using the word, but I had a book with wellness in the title, which made it difficult. But when you Googled wellness until recently, the #1 hit was dog food. And there are 500 million hits for the name wellness, but most of them had nothing to do with what Dr. Dunn inspired in the 50s. And I'm curious, has functional medicine suffered any of the same dumbing down, or are people climbing onto it? I keep hearing of people saying they're doing functional medicine that I don't really know if it's the same thing or not.
Yeah, thank you. That is a really insightful comment, observation. I think you test the success of something by how many people appropriate it and convert it into their own. And that has been a lesson that I've learned over the decades. What you want is an idea that you have sponsored or been affiliated with to be so attractive that other people will spend their time, energy, and maybe even money to make it more real and more robust. And what you find is not all of those things they will do are consistent with what you set out to want to do. But in the spirit of collaboration and community and building a concept, you've got to accept the randomness of that process. And so we have in the functional medicine domain exploiters who have misused the term as we would have liked it to have been used and have done it for their own self-gratification or financial interest. And then we have those that are really selfless and are trying to advance it to really help people as the principal focus of their activity, and probably everything in between. And what I've come to recognize is that in the end, if you take the broad perspective, you play the big game, the end game, these things tend to work themselves out. They smooth themselves out. And what is right survives, and what is wrong has its moment and dies. And I believe that if there is some truth in the concept of function as a measurement of systems that go beyond individual organs working in isolation, and that is a progenitor to allow us to define and quantify wellness because it gives us an objectifiable way of getting to wellness, then it will survive and it will have a purity of the idea. If not, and it's just an artifact, it will be replaced by something better. So that's how I kind of view the whole process of the evolution of ideas.
I was surprised to discover that the Cleveland Clinic is a hotbed with Mark Hyman and others. I don't know much about, Hyman's name is all over the place, but we've never met. And he's on my list to track down at some point. But are they pretty much following the same definitions of functional medicine as yours?
Absolutely. Mark, I don't believe, I hope this doesn't sound pejorative, but Mark was an emergency room physician in Idaho when I first met him. And he then went on to take a job at Canyon Ranch in Lenox, Mass, and was encouraged to come to one of our early stage functional medicine training sessions, which was in Gig Harbor. This would have been in the early 90s. And Mark is a very fast learner, very skillful synthesizer of ideas, and a very good doctor. and he picked up on what we were trying to train and see like white on rice, just unbelievably quickly. And I could see immediately over the course of those, back in those days, the training sessions were 2 5-day sessions separated by 6 months. So over the course of that year of having him in those 10 days of courses, I saw this guy is got it. He's got all the right stuff. So I think I'm very proud. He calls me his mentor. He then took this to a whole nother level, and he's a tremendous writer. I think he now has 11 or 12 New York Times best-selling books that have applied the functional medicine concepts into various areas. His present book called Food First is a wonderful manifesto for this whole problem we have with processed, ultra-processed foods. But Mark then, I later kind of twisted his arm to become the chairman of the board of the Institute for Functional Medicine, which he did for 5 years. He then became busy in his practice and ultimately starting the Functional Medicine Center at the Cleveland Clinic in Cleveland, where he was traveling back and forth between Lenox, Mass. and Cleveland, Ohio. And the clinic was being run by Dr. Patrick Hanaway, who was another functional medicine doctor who had actually been the medical director at Genova Diagnostics, an incredibly talented physician. So Mark and Patrick then set up and ran the the Functional Medicine Center Cleveland Clinic, which now has been built out and occupies several thousand square feet of prime space in the Cleveland Clinic facilities in their new neurology building. And it is a clinic that's booked up, I think, over a year in advance, and is extraordinarily busy, and has published its first outcome study in JAMA last year showing positive benefit of going through that center versus a normal family practice center for chronic management of chronic health problems. So I think that has advanced the concept of functional medicine dramatically by being in residence in the Cleveland Clinic and having the access to all the extraordinary talent that's there in the area of psychometrics, biometrics, epidemiology, internal medicine, and all the other subspecialties, and having access to a very large patient flow, some tens of thousands of patients now, to test the model. So I really applaud Mark and Patrick Hanaway both for what they've accomplished there. It's remarkable.
Mm-hmm. That's also reminds me when I did a little research in Wikipedia, I discovered that you had been trolled, like so many, with the trolls. And how long is it going to take them to get that they're wrong?
You know, that's a very interesting question. We've done obviously some diligence on asking who it is that is curating on Wikipedia, that site, the holistic, integrative, functional medicine stuff. And as much as I really think the world of Wikipedia and democratizing information, I fundamentally, I'm a very strong supporter for the philosophy. When it actually comes down to curation and to where the tire meets the road, the process is a lot less robust than I had thought. And it's a lot more incestuous than I wanted to believe. Mm-hmm. And if you get on the wrong side of the evaluating schema, it's very hard to bring those people who are in the power of that group, because there's different power structures within Wikipedia, to bring them back into some kind of informed position. And it's unfortunate because, well, for many reasons I could go on and on, but let me just summarize by saying, if you're a believer that truth will out, which I am, you can tell from my previous comments, mm-hmm. that these things that misrepresent or, well, let's just use the word misrepresent reality, because they only give a portion of a story and they package the story in such a way as to create an image. It's the true situation. If in fact that is off center from truth, I believe that eventually truth wins out against all institutions. You have to have patience, however. Sometimes that truth takes longer than a lifetime. But if the idea really is true, then you shouldn't be worried about the moment. And that's kind of where I am. I've been criticized by many, many people over many years. I've had debates with Victor Herbert and many, many individuals who take an opposite opinion about all sorts of things than I. And I value from their criticism and their opinions. I try to listen carefully and see where I think I can learn something of value from their perspective. But in the end, I'm oftentimes reminded as I hear them in their criticism that they don't know what they're talking about because they haven't dug deep enough. They haven't read the thousands of papers I've read. They haven't traveled 6 million miles. They haven't met the thousands of opinion leaders that I have met. They've lived in a bubble or a cocoon with I call it intellectual hemophilia, and they're inbred. And that is them. That's not me. So that's kind of how I kind of, maybe it sounds a little self-righteous, but I think I have, with 40 some years of experience in the travel, I put in the hard work, and I think I've done the diligence to pursue a certain kind of truth that I think will out, and we'll find out.
Which brings me to probably one of our last topics of the current pandemic, and I just was given a link of 12 leading epidemiologist types, all basically saying the cure is worse than the disease. And the data are shaky. This guy at Stanford, whose name I can't pronounce, an Italian name, who's, I don't know if you know who it is, but apparently he's showing up a lot, claiming his whole field of study is the reliability of data and how unreliable the data is that these decisions are being made. So I'm curious, what's your take on where we're going, what we're doing, and whether it's the right path?
Yeah, thank you. So I wrote an article called "What I've Learned from COVID-19," and I published it in Medium, which is a public access, journal blogging site. It's not refereed, so it's just people who want to write about things, and hopefully they've done it in a way that meets a certain level of scholarship. So I posted that in the Medium 2 weeks ago. It's gotten over 200,000 looks now. And the reason I think it has is that I raised a question in that article as to, could it be that COVID-19 is really the quintessential lifestyle disease? It's not just a virus. It's a virus in a socio-political, economic, cultural, biological, global, planetary incubator. Mm-hmm. And the virus you can't change. It's been mutated to be what it is. It has a certain level of infectivity and pathogenicity. But what you can change, which are modifiable, are the response that a population has to it by modifying those things that relate to the structure and function of our society, our global society. And when you take it from that perspective, which it takes me way back to my experience with HIV/AIDS in the 1981 and 2 when I was at the Pauling Institute, it reminds me that there are so many things that we're not addressing that relate to the susceptibility to infection that is more important than the virus itself, because we're going to have other viruses. These pandemics will not go away. They're going to come, maybe even with increasing frequency because of global climatic changes and cultural crowding and the way we've designed society. And if so, we ought to be addressing the modifiable factors of how the environment, our lifestyle, speaks to our hemopoietic stem cells that creates our immune defense system. And that is a modifiable factor. And there are many things that we can do that make what might be a pandemic into just an infection. Mm-hmm. And of certain individuals. And when you start looking at the racial disparity in the seriousness of COVID-19, or you look at the difference between males and females, 60+% males and 35% plus females, you start to ask the question, why would there be the segmentation of pathogenicity if it's the same virus? Is it genes? And the answer is no, it doesn't seem to be genes at all. Is it social determinants of disease? Yes, I think it is. And are the social determinants of disease modifiable if we ask the right questions about individuals' own state of environment and health? And the answer is yes. And where are we spending the time doing that? We're not. Because we have a segmentation of our, what we call healthcare system, into the 600-pound gorilla in the corner that's called the disease care system. That's all around medical diagnosis and interventional treatment. And then we have the 30-pound community health system called public health that has very little impact and is seen as a stepchild to where all the action is. Immunize and treat, find new drugs. When the real issue is on the other side of the house as to how we create an environment of equal opportunity for a vigilant immune system. And that is an addressable and solvable problem if we put the energy into it. And I'm pleased to say that my activities of the last 40 years are involved with being impacted by people like you who are creating the other side of the house as an equal voice at the table to create what will be the 21st century healthcare system. And it will not be that we have of a legacy of the 20th century, of the previous century.
I was just reading an article today about the impact of public health in the 20th century, which largely is unrecognized. And I have been exposed to a lot of data about the efficacy of vaccines and the fact that most of the diseases were actually decreasing at a similar rate, and the vaccines didn't really make a difference. Was it the public health? Was it better sanitation? You know, all of these. In my MPH back in the 70s at Hopkins, they public health, you know, clean water supply had a lot more to do with public health than all the antibiotics ever produced. And yet that's ignored. So it's interesting that it had a big impact, but it's largely unrecognized. And
well, let me give you a thought, and it probably syncs up with your thinking as well. I believe that the reason that public health became the stepchild to interventional medicine, and there are many reasons, but one of them is it doesn't attach itself to individuals in a way that is really sentient and meaningful. Seatbelts, immunization, pap smears, breast exams, colonoscopies, you know, those are really great kind of concepts, but you have to bring it down to the individual because that's where the action point is, because people will always think it's somebody else. I'm not part of that public, I'm me. And I'm very encouraged that we have a movement that's growing up right now in the 21st century called precision public health. Precision public health is really the interface between what I call personalized lifestyle healthcare and public health. And I've been, you know, I formed this new institute in 2013 called the Personalized Lifestyle Medicine Institute, because I wanted to advance the concept that lifestyle medicine in and of itself doesn't catch. It only catches if it's personalized to the individual's need and they can identify meeting their aspiration for health. Because if you ask the question to a person, which we've done now for thousands of people, what is your definition of health? You will find as many definitions as, well, maybe not as many as people, but you'll find a very large variety of definitions. And in a study that we did to ask that question, we did not find a single person who said their definition of health is the absence of disease. We found that people's definition of health had something to do with their function. Thinking better, acting better, less pain, more energy, less depression, better sleep. I mean, for them, it was all sorts of differing variables that related to their function, not the absence of disease. And if you think of how public health has been tethered, it's been tethered to disease risk reduction, which means it's owned by the disease care system. We got to break that trust. We got to uncouple that. We have to have a new language to meet what people really are interested in, not a fear-based model, but a model based upon the aspiration of their desire for function. And when you deliver that in the system with precision personalized healthcare, now suddenly you're going to get adoption. That's my advocacy.
Interesting. Yeah, I've been tracking down some of the other lifestyle medicine people. It turns out my neighbor in Mullumbimby, New South Wales, is the co-founder of the Australasian Lifestyle Medicine Institute. And then I've been trying to get some of the US ones. John Adams and his colleague, they've been reluctant to be interviewed. I'm still trying to get one of them to agree. They don't know me, and I didn't know them. But I did interview Dean Ornish a couple of weeks ago, and in doing my research, found out that he and Mark Hyman have come to almost blows about their differing views on the role of fat. And I had encountered a colleague, Rod Newton in Ashland, Oregon, who I think he was actually at the same workshop that Chuck Hess was at in Costa Rica, who was helping people keto adapt was his plan. And I did that 4 years. I started editing their booklet. They wanted to publish it. He was working with a naturopath, and it was fascinating. And then I undertook it myself. I went 2 months with mainly almost no carbohydrates. And now I fast 36 hours once a week to maintain my ketone levels. And it's shifted my whole approach to food. Like I do intermittent fasting, try to eat in an 8-hour window, and not hungry for lunch. It's really shifted my biochemistry. And I think that fats have gotten a bad name, but boy, the American Heart Association doesn't want to buy that. And this big divide between the low fat craze of 30 years that didn't really do anything. I'm curious where you are on fats, saturated fats of.
Well, I think this is obviously a very complex topic with lots of different components to it. Because when we saw the revolution occurring within the food industry to form low-fat diets, what they really became is high-sugar diets. Mm-hmm. And so there's really, people talk about carbohydrates are dangerous, and I'm an absolute alien, contrarian to the concept that you can define anything based upon the three major macronutrients by just saying protein, carbohydrate, and fat.
Yeah.
I think those are misleading, because within each of those terms are multiple different physiological characteristics of different components. Proteins can vary dramatically from vegetable to animal, and even within animal and vegetable proteins, there's distinctive differences in their physiology based upon their amino acid composition and their structure. Similarly with carbohydrate, there's an unbelievable difference between the glycemic effect of a high complex carbohydrate, unrefined, fiber-rich carbohydrate, and a highly modified pectin-containing starch. So I think that, and the same for fats, the difference between saturated, unsaturated, short, medium, and long chain fatty acids, different chain length, different degrees of unsaturation, to try to lump them all together under the term fats is ludicrous in light of what we know together. And there are literally decades of, quote, scientific studies in nutrition that have been published that people cite as policy documents that are bad science because they never defined what the composition was of the macronutrients. They just said so many calorie percent of this, that, and the other, which is ludicrous. Yeah. You might as well throw all that data out. It doesn't mean jack. What really means a difference is the compositional analysis of the unique features of those molecules that have their each and individual signature on how they influence physiology through their gene expression patterns and regulation of metabolomics. That is how nutrition should be looked at. And all of that data from which we make policy decisions is junk. Mm-hmm. And so I don't subscribe to, I don't get caught up in this polar argument between, say, an Ornish and a Hyman on this issue. I try to ask, let's look at the compositional matter that makes up these diets and ask how they affect physiology, rather than just talk about, is fat bad, fat good, carbohydrate bad, fat, carbohydrate good. Let's really look
Yeah.
at the personalities of the molecules.
And then they don't take into account how the fats were cooked in
That's
the
right.
presence of oxygen, frying, like that to me is a huge variable that's completely ignored. And anyway, thank you for your thoughts on that.
I think if I could just close by saying, it's interesting to me because I can stand like arm's length distance from both Dr. Ornish and Dr. Hyman. I respect them both. I think they both have huge contributions that they have made and will continue to make. Dean Ornish is a pioneer and a star. I mean, his work that he did back when I was just at the Pauling Institute, starting to work up there in Claremont on his studies on what later became the Ornish diet and program, is pioneering. And those publications he had in JAMA early on with the resorption of plaque after intervention are extraordinarily important parts of our legacy. Similarly, Mark Hyman has made incredible contributions to people looking at their diet and their lifestyles in terms of their functional outcome and health. Both of them have made very important contributions. And I think sometimes what gets lost at the frontier is the differences that they might have versus the similarity in creating the cultural context that we've got to take charge of our health with things that each day we are in control of.
Yeah. Well said. Wow, this has been quite a tour of.
It has. Thanks. I've enjoyed it very much.
Any final parting thoughts or wisdom for future generations that we hope will encounter this after we're gone?
Well, I think that hopefully you, John, are very proud when you look back as being a pioneer in the development of this thinking, which was went uphill against a very big barrier of conventional thinking at the time. But over time, as we started to see the world shrink, and we recognize through COVID-19 that we can't just be in our own little rabbit warren. We are connected globally to all other cultures and all our biomes, and that we are responsible as stewards of this planet to work responsibly and be cognizant of other people's, and wellness is a term that defines resilience of not just our own bodies, but resilience of relationships, resilience of families, of cities, of countries, and of the globe. And I think that we have started or we're contributing to a concept that I believe will leave a legacy for a generation that's represented by the age of my grandchildren that are going to create a new reality. And the models of Keynesian economics and a lot of the things that we grew up on that were valid for the time in the new frontier are not so valid in this new globally connected world in which capital is ones and zeros in a computer, and we're all interconnected with equal access to information through the internet. This new age is going to be built around different perceptions of what culture will look like. And the Guardians of the Gate are a bunch of white old men that are holding on to the old model, which I think we have given some tools to the next generation to create the new model. It's a very exciting time.
Well said. Great conclusion there. And thank you so much for your time.